Billionaire Elijah Moore lost his son 10 years ago. Every week he visits his grave. But one day he notices an unfamiliar boy laying flowers there. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. Elijah Moore had everything the world envied: wealth, influence, and an empire of art that stretched across continents. His name carried weight in the highest circles, whispered in galleries, auction houses, and corporate boardrooms alike. But behind the grandeur of his name, beyond the glass walls of his penthouse and the carefully curated collection of priceless masterpieces, there was a silence that nothing could fill. For over a decade, he had lived alone, wrapped in the illusion that power and possessions could replace what he had lost. The loss of his son, Julian, had been the only battle he had ever lost, and it was the only one that mattered. Unlike business deals and negotiations, grief could not be outmaneuvered. It could not be silenced with money. It was a shadow that followed him, a weight that had settled into the very bones of his existence. He never spoke about Julian, not to his advisors, not to his few remaining acquaintances. He had buried his son, and, along with him, the last remnants of what once made him human. In the years since Julian's death, Elijah had thrown himself into his work, turning his fortune into an empire so vast it seemed almost eternal. But no matter how many acquisitions he made, no matter how much of the world he consumed, the void remained. There was only one place he allowed himself to acknowledge the weight of his loss. Every Sunday morning, at precisely the same time, Elijah visited Julian's grave. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, nestled in the quiet embrace of towering oak trees, their leaves whispering with the wind. It was a place of stillness, a stark contrast to the relentless pace of the world Elijah commanded. He never stayed long. He did not kneel before the gravestone, nor did he bring flowers. He simply stood there, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, staring at the marble slab where his son's name was engraved. Julian Moore, 1987-2013. No elaborate epitaph, no poetic farewell. Just a name and two dates that mark the brief span of a life. He would stand there in silence, his face unreadable, his mind wrestling with the ghosts of memory. And then, after a few minutes, he would turn and leave, returning to the world that expected him to be invincible. But this Sunday was different. As he walked down the familiar path between the rows of headstones, his sharp eyes caught something unusual: a small bouquet of wildflowers resting against Julian's grave. Elijah stopped in his tracks. No one visited this grave. He had made sure of that. Julian had severed most of his connections before his death, and Elijah had seen to it that the past remained buried. But someone had been here, someone who had left a gift where no one ever did. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the cemetery, and that was when he saw him. A boy. He couldn't have been older than 10 or 11. He stood a few steps away from the grave, staring at it with an expression far too solemn for a child. His dark skin glowed in the morning light, and his small hands hung stiffly by his sides as if he were waiting for something. Elijah watched, frozen by an inexplicable sense of unease. The boy was not just passing through, he was here with purpose. Then, without a sound, the boy turned and began to walk away. Something in Elijah reacted before he could think. His feet moved forward, his deep voice breaking the stillness of the air. "Wait!" The boy's body stiffened. His head snapped toward Elijah, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. Elijah saw it clearly. Fear. Not the fear of a child caught doing something wrong, but something deeper. It was the fear of being seen. And then the boy ran. Elijah's pulse quickened as the child bolted through the gravestones, his small figure disappearing into the thick green of the trees that bordered the cemetery. He didn't know why, but he chased after him. His shoes crunched against the damp earth, his long strides quickly closing the distance. He had never been the kind of man to run. He had people to do that for him. And yet, here he was, pursuing a boy whose presence had shaken something deep within him. But the child was fast, impossibly fast. By the time Elijah reached the line of trees, the boy was gone, swallowed by the dense foliage. Elijah stopped, breathing hard. His chest rose and fell in sharp, controlled breaths, his hands clenched into fists. He hadn't run like that in years. He hadn't felt like this in years. As he stood at the edge of the forest, a thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't shake. Who was that boy? And why had he come to Julian's grave? That night, as Elijah sat in his vast, empty penthouse, he found himself staring at the city skyline without truly seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the image of a small figure standing before his son's grave, placing wildflowers with a reverence that didn't make sense. For the first time in years, something unsettled him, something that money and power couldn't immediately solve. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he knew when the past was knocking at his door. And this time, he wasn't sure he could ignore it. Elijah barely slept that night. It wasn't insomnia. He'd battled that beast before. This was different. His mind was restless, turning over the events of the morning with a relentless precision that refused to let go. He could still see the boy standing there, silent, motionless, as if the weight of something unseen held him in place. And then, the way he had run, vanishing into the trees like a ghost that never should have been seen. For years, Elijah had controlled every aspect of his life. There were no surprises in his world, no loose ends. His empire thrived on certainty, on careful calculations and flawless execution. Yet today, a child had slipped through his fingers, leaving behind nothing but questions. By dawn, he had made a decision. He needed to find that boy. The moment his assistant, Charles, arrived at the penthouse, Elijah gave him a simple but firm instruction. Find out who he is. Charles was a man who never asked unnecessary questions. He nodded, pulling out his tablet to begin the task. Any details? He asked. Elijah exhaled, rubbing his jaw. He rarely had to rely on vague descriptions. When he wanted information, it was usually precise. Dates, names, records, but this time all he had was an image in his mind. A boy, 10 or 11, black, slim, fast. Anything else? Elijah hesitated, then added, he was at Julian's grave. He left flowers. Charles glanced up at that, his professional mask barely shifting. He knew better than to bring up Julian. I'll see what I can find, he said simply. Elijah nodded and turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the skyline. He never looked for things he didn't already control. But this was different. He had to know. 3 days passed with no results. Elijah continued with his work, attending board meetings, discussing acquisitions, and maintaining the face the world expected of him. But beneath the surface, the encounter at the cemetery gnawed at him like an unsolved equation. Then, on the 4th evening, Charles returned with a name. Malik Carter, he said, placing a folder on Elijah's desk. 11 years old. Lives in Westwood with his mother, Amara Carter. Elijah's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of his desk. The name meant nothing to him. Any connections to Julian? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. None that I found, Charles replied. No records of them knowing each other, but the boy has been visiting the grave for months. Always alone. Elijah's gaze sharpened. Why? Charles hesitated. I don't know, but if you want answers, I'd suggest going to the source. Elijah picked up the folder, flipping through its contents. There was a photo of Malik, a school picture. He looked younger than 11, his small frame almost swallowed by the oversized polo shirt. His eyes were dark, guarded. Then there was a picture of his mother. Elijah froze. He had seen her before. It wasn't immediate recognition, but a deep, unsettling familiarity. She wasn't someone from his social circles, not a name in the business world or the art scene. But something in her face, in the way her eyes held a quiet strength, pulled at a memory just out of reach. Find out where she works, Elijah said. Charles was already ahead of him. She works at a local clinic, pediatric nurse. A nurse, not the kind of person who crossed paths with billionaires. Elijah closed the folder. His decision was made. Tomorrow he would meet Amara Carter. The next morning, Elijah found himself in an unfamiliar part of the city. Westwood was nothing like the glass and steel world he ruled. The streets here were lined with aging buildings, small family-run businesses, and corner stores with faded signs. It wasn't poverty, but it was a world built on hard work and resilience rather than inherited wealth and corporate power. His car, sleek and black, stood out like a foreign object among the older vehicles parked along the street. People watched him as he stepped out, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet wariness. The clinic was small but well kept. Inside, the waiting room was filled with children and parents, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and baby lotion. A receptionist looked up as he approached. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Amara Carter," Elijah said. The woman frowned. "She's with a patient right now. Do you have an appointment?" Elijah wasn't used to waiting. He considered pressing the issue, but then, before he could respond, a door at the end of the hallway opened. And there she was. Amara Carter stepped out, holding a clipboard, her dark curls pulled back in a loose bun. She spoke softly to a young boy beside her, reassuring him before sending him off with his mother. Then she looked up. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something else. Something sharper. She knew who he was. She didn't look surprised, but neither did she look pleased. Instead, she took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward him with quiet confidence. "Mr. Moore," she said evenly, "I wasn't expecting you." Elijah studied her, searching for any hint of familiarity beyond the nagging feeling in his gut. "You know who I am." Amara's expression didn't change. "Everyone in this city knows who you are." There was no awe in her voice, no deference. If anything, there was restraint, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I need to talk to you," Elijah said. "It's about your son." A flicker of something crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "I'm working right now. If you want to talk, you'll have to wait." Elijah wasn't used to being dismissed, but before he could respond, she turned away, disappearing through the next door without another word. He exhaled sharply. This woman, this stranger, had answers, and he would get them, even if it meant playing by her rules. Elijah Moore was not accustomed to waiting. His entire life had been built on the principle of control. Control over time, over people, over outcomes. In his world, delays were unacceptable. Obstacles were mere inconveniences to be swiftly removed. But as he sat in his car outside the small clinic in Westwood, he realized with growing irritation that Amara Carter was forcing him into unfamiliar territory. She had made him wait. After their brief exchange at the clinic, she hadn't emerged again. The receptionist, sensing his impatience, had politely informed him that Amara wouldn't be available for another 2 hours. 2 hours. Elijah hadn't waited 2 hours for anything in decades. And yet, here he was. The city hummed around him, a different rhythm from the one he was used to. People walked along the sidewalks, mothers holding their children's hands, teenagers laughing, street vendors calling out to passers-by. It was a life untouched by the pursuit of wealth, by corporate battles and high-stakes negotiations. A life Elijah had long forgotten. He glanced at his watch. 1 hour had passed. This was absurd. He could have sent someone to bring her to him. He could have arranged a meeting at a place of his choosing where he dictated the terms. But something told him that approach wouldn't work with Amara Carter. She was different. She held herself with a quiet strength, a calm defiance that suggested she had long since decided she owed nothing to men like him. When the clinic doors finally opened and she stepped outside, Elijah was already out of his car, waiting. She saw him immediately. There was no surprise in her expression, no irritation, only a resigned sigh as if she had expected this. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and walked toward him with steady steps. "You don't give up easily," she said. Elijah didn't smile. "No." Amara studied him for a moment, then nodded towards the small cafe across the street. "If you want to talk, we do it there. 10 minutes. Elijah inclined his head slightly, accepting the terms. They crossed the street in silence. The cafe was modest, the kind of place where people knew each other by name. A bell chimed softly as they entered, and the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. Amara led him to a corner table, away from the other patrons. She sat first. He followed. A waitress approached, smiling warmly at Amara. "The usual?" Amara nodded. "And?" She glanced at Elijah. "Coffee?" He gave a brief nod, and the waitress left them alone. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Amara exhaled, folding her hands on the table. "I assume you didn't track me down for medical advice." Elijah met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "No." "Then let's not waste time. What do you want?" He leaned slightly forward. "Your son, Malik. Why does he visit my son's grave?" There. The question that had been haunting him for days. The question that had led him here. Amara didn't flinch, but something in her eyes shifted. Something almost imperceptible. She lowered her gaze briefly, as if weighing her words before looking back at him. "You already know the answer," she said quietly. Elijah's chest tightened. He didn't know the answer. He suspected. But hearing her say it, he needed that confirmation. "Say it," he demanded. Amara's fingers curled slightly against the table. She didn't speak right away, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse. But then, finally, she did. "Malik is Julian's son." The words landed like a physical blow. Elijah didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared at her, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what she had just revealed. His son, Julian, had a child, and he had never known. His grip on reality wavered, years of carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble all at once. No, it wasn't possible. "You're lying," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. Amara's jaw tightened. "I'm not." He shook his head. "Julian would have told me." "He didn't know," she said, her voice softer now. "I found out I was pregnant after he died." Elijah's world tilted. He struggled to hold on to something solid, something rational. His son had been a father, and Elijah had been a grandfather for 11 years without knowing. He forced himself to breathe, to stay composed. "Why didn't you come to me?" Amara let out a humorless laugh. "Come to you. You didn't even want Julian. What would have made me think you'd want Malik?" Elijah flinched. It was a direct hit, and they both knew it. He had been hard on Julian. Too hard. He had seen his son as weak, unfit to carry the Moore legacy. And now, sitting across from the woman who had given birth to Julian's child, he was faced with the consequences of his own blind ambition. His silence stretched between them. The waitress returned, placing their coffees on the table. Amara thanked her, but Elijah barely registered the interaction. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Why does Malik visit the grave?" Amara looked down at her coffee. "Because he wants to know who his father was." Elijah swallowed. "He's been asking about Julian for years," she continued. "I told him what I could, but there was only so much I could say. He never got to meet his father. He never even got to see a picture of them together. So he started going to the cemetery, on his own, to feel close to him." Elijah's throat tightened. The image of that small boy, standing in front of Julian's grave with a bouquet of wildflowers, took on a devastating new meaning. "He wanted to meet you," Amara added, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he was afraid. I told him you wouldn't care." Elijah's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He had spent years believing that Julian was gone forever, that there was nothing left of his son in this world. And now, here was Malik, flesh and blood, carrying a part of Julian inside him, a boy who had been waiting for a grandfather who never came. He had failed Julian in life. Would he fail his son's son as well? The weight of it settled over him like a suffocating fog. He didn't know how to be a father. He had proven that. And he certainly didn't know how to be a grandfather. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, Elijah Moore didn't know what to do. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. Elijah had always believed that truth, no matter how painful, could be controlled, shaped, turned into something useful. But this truth, Malik, had shattered him in a way no financial crisis or corporate betrayal ever could. He sat in the cafe long after Amara had left, staring into the dark swirl of his untouched coffee. The revelation echoed in his mind, each repetition hitting with the force of a hammer. Julian had a son. And Elijah had spent 11 years unaware of his existence. When he finally stepped out into the street, the city seemed different, less familiar, less predictable. His world, once built on certainties, was suddenly unsteady beneath his feet. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a plan. He needed time to think. That night, Elijah returned to his penthouse, but the sterile luxury of his home offered no comfort. He wandered through the vast, empty rooms, past priceless paintings and sculptures that once symbolized his conquests. Now they felt meaningless. He found himself standing in his study, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. They were carefully curated, images of him shaking hands with presidents, standing beside world-renowned artists, accepting awards. But there were no pictures of Julian. The realization sent a sharp pain through him. He had erased his son, not intentionally, but effectively. His focus had been on building an empire, on maintaining the Moore legacy, and yet the only real legacy that mattered, his family, had slipped through his fingers. Now there was Malik, a boy he didn't know, a boy who had grown up without a father, without a grandfather, a boy who had spent years visiting a grave, trying to piece together an identity from a name carved in stone. Elijah had always believed that wealth could solve any problem, but this couldn't be bought. The next morning, he made a decision. He needed to see Malik. He needed to understand the boy who had unknowingly upended his world. Elijah knew better than to simply show up at Amara's door. She had made it clear that she didn't trust him. So he chose a different approach. He went back to the cemetery. It was early, the morning air crisp with the scent of damp earth. The grounds were empty except for the occasional groundskeeper trimming the grass. Elijah stood by Julian's grave, waiting. An hour passed, then another, and then, finally, he saw him. Malik approached cautiously, his small frame barely visible against the backdrop of gravestones. He moved with purpose, but there was hesitation in his steps, as if he sensed something was different. Then he saw Elijah. The boy froze. Elijah remained still, careful not to startle him. Their eyes met. Dark, guarded, searching. Malik's fist tightened at his sides. "You're the man from before," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a challenge in it. Elijah nodded. "Yes." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Why are you here?" Malik asked finally. Elijah considered his answer. He had spent his life crafting words, spinning narratives that served his interests. But this was different. This required something he wasn't used to. Honesty. "I wanted to see you," he said. Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across his face. "Why?" Elijah hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Because I just found out who you are." Something flickered in the boy's expression, something quick and unreadable. He glanced at the grave, then back at Elijah. "You knew my dad?" Elijah swallowed. "He was my son." Malik's lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. He looked back at the gravestone, his fingers tightening around the small bouquet of flowers he held. "Mom said you wouldn't care," he said after a moment. The words stung. Elijah took a slow breath. "She had reasons to believe that." Malik frowned, studying him. "Do you?" the boy asked. The question was simple, and yet it carried the weight of everything Elijah had ever feared. Did he care? He thought of Julian, the boy who had grown up in his shadow, who had sought his approval but never received it. He thought of all the years he had spent prioritizing his empire over his own blood. And now he looked at Malik, a boy who should have never had to question whether his family cared. "Yes," Elijah said finally, "I care." Malik didn't react immediately. He simply stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once as if filing the information away. Then, without another word, he turned and walked past Elijah, kneeling before the grave. Elijah watched in silence as Malik placed the flowers down, his small hands brushing against the cold stone. A minute passed, then 2. Elijah didn't move. When Malik finally stood up, he hesitated, then looked back at him. "Are you going to come back?" Elijah exhaled. "Do you want me to?" The boy considered this. Then, with a small shrug, he said, "Maybe." And with that, he turned and walked away. Elijah remained standing there long after Malik had gone. He had expected resistance. He had expected anger, maybe even hatred. He hadn't expected possibility. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar stir within him. Hope. Elijah Moore was a man who had always belonged to the world of control, wealth, and power. But, as he sat in the back seat of his black sedan, staring out at the unfamiliar streets of Westwood, he realized just how far removed he had become from the life his grandson knew. The streets here were narrow, lined with small houses that bore the signs of wear, paint fading, porches sagging slightly, yards cluttered with bicycles and toys. It was a place built on hard work, a stark contrast to the polished luxury Elijah had surrounded himself with for decades. He had spent his life ensuring that Julian would never have to live in a place like this. But Julian hadn't stayed in Elijah's world. He had chosen a different path, and now his son, his grandson, was growing up in a reality Elijah had never touched. Malik's words from their last meeting echoed in his mind. "Are you going to come back?" He had said, "Maybe." Elijah wasn't a man of maybe. He was a man of decisions, of absolutes. And yet, for the first time in years, he was stepping into something uncertain. Today, he wasn't here for a business deal or an acquisition. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to see Malik. And he had no idea how to do that. The front door of the modest house opened before he could knock. Amara Carter stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You're persistent," she said, eyes scanning him as if trying to determine whether his presence was worth her time. Elijah met her gaze without hesitation. "I told you I wouldn't walk away from this." Her lips pressed together slightly, but she nodded once, stepping aside. "He's in the backyard." Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The house was small but well kept. The walls were lined with photos. Malik as a baby, as a toddler, his smile wide and unburdened. There were no pictures of Julian. Elijah forced himself to keep walking. The back door led to a modest yard where Malik was kneeling in the dirt, carefully adjusting something within the patch of a small vegetable garden. The boy didn't look up right away. "You came back," Malik said finally, still focused on the plants in front of him. Elijah stepped closer, noting the concentration on the boy's face. "I said I would." There was a long pause before Malik finally looked up, studying Elijah as if measuring his words. "Did you ever garden?" Elijah blinked at the question. Of all the things he had expected Malik to say, that hadn't been one of them. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." Malik wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. "Then why are you here?" Elijah wasn't sure how to answer that, not in a way that the boy would believe. "I want to get to know you," he said eventually. Malik frowned slightly. "Why?" Elijah hesitated, then exhaled. "Because I should have a long time ago." The boy didn't say anything for a while. He glanced toward the house, then back at Elijah. "Mom says rich people don't do things unless they want something." Elijah almost smiled. The kid was sharp. "Your mother's a smart woman," he said. "But I don't want anything from you, Malik." Another pause. Malik kicked at the dirt slightly with his sneaker. "Are you really my grandpa?" Elijah felt something tighten in his chest. "Yes," he said softly. Malik seemed to consider this, his small fingers curling at his sides. "I never had one before," he said finally. "What do grandpas do?" Elijah opened his mouth, then closed it. What did grandfathers do? His own father had never been the affectionate type. His childhood had been filled with expectations and discipline, not warmth or guidance. He had never had a real example of what a grandfather should be, and he had never thought about it until this moment. "I suppose," Elijah said carefully, "they're just there when you need them." Malik nodded once, as if filing away the answer. Then, after a long silence, he bent down, grabbed an empty pot from the dirt, and held it out. "Then help me with this." Elijah looked at the pot. It was small, chipped at the edges. He had never so much as touched soil with his own hands. And yet, when Malik placed it into his grip, he found himself holding on to it as if it were something delicate, something important. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Over the next several weeks, Elijah returned. At first, his visits were brief, guarded. He never stayed too long, never overstayed his welcome, but little by little, something shifted. Malik, once wary, began asking questions about Julian, about Elijah's life, about things he didn't understand about the world. And Elijah, to his own surprise, answered them, not in the way he was used to, with careful calculations and measured words, but honestly. He told Malik about Julian, not as an heir, not as a businessman, but as a boy who had once been just as small, just as curious. Malik listened intently. And then, one day, something changed. It was a quiet afternoon. Malik had been showing Elijah how to repot a plant, his small hands expertly packing the soil, when he suddenly looked up and said, "Did my dad ever like gardening?" Elijah hesitated. He had never thought about it. He had never asked Julian if he liked things like that. "I don't know," he admitted. Malik considered this, then nodded as if it made sense. "I think he would have," he said finally. "I think he would have liked this." Elijah swallowed against the unexpected tightness in his throat. For the first time, he realized how much he had missed, not just in Julian's life, but in the life of the grandson who had been waiting for someone to care. As the sun set that evening, Malik looked up at him and said, "You can come back tomorrow if you want." And for the first time in a long time, Elijah didn't feel like an outsider in someone else's world. He felt like he belonged. Elijah Moore had never been a man of patience. In the corporate world, hesitation was weakness. Delays were costly. Success was measured in swift decisions and control over every possible variable. But this was different. For the first time in years, he found himself in a position where control was an illusion. He couldn't force Malik to trust him. He couldn't buy back the years he had lost or rewrite the past. All he could do was show up. And so, he did. His visits to Amara's house became routine, though nothing about them felt routine to Elijah. At first, he wasn't sure where he fit in. Malik was hesitant, and Amara remained wary. She never stopped him from coming, but she also never encouraged it. She watched from a quiet distance, making it clear that trust would have to be earned. Malik, however, was a different challenge altogether. The boy was sharp, observant. He didn't blindly accept Elijah's presence, nor did he immediately embrace the idea of having a grandfather. But he was curious. And slowly, that curiosity started to break down the walls between them. Elijah learned that Malik liked to test people. He would throw out small challenges, waiting to see how Elijah would react. One afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, Malik asked suddenly, "Do you know how to play chess?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Of course." Malik smirked. "Bet you're not that good." Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. "You're underestimating me." Malik crossed his arms. "Then prove it." The boy disappeared inside and returned a moment later with a wooden chess set, the edges of the board slightly worn from use. He set it up with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. Elijah studied the arrangement, his fingers resting against his chin. "Who taught you?" "Mom," Malik said, moving his first pawn. "She said my dad used to play sometimes." Elijah's stomach tightened slightly. He had never played chess with Julian. He hadn't even known Julian liked it. He moved his own piece without hesitation, pushing down the ache in his chest. The game was surprisingly competitive. Malik was good, better than Elijah had expected. The boy thought ahead, setting up traps, testing Elijah's strategy. By the time Elijah finally won, Malik sat back, nodding in approval. "Not bad." Elijah chuckled. "Not bad. I just beat you." Malik shrugged. "Only by a little." There was something in his tone, something almost playful. It was the closest thing to warmth Elijah had received from him. It was a small victory. And Elijah was learning to appreciate the small victories. The weeks passed, and the connection between them grew. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Malik started asking Elijah more questions. Some were simple, about his work, about his life. Others were harder. Why didn't you and my dad get along? Elijah had never been good at admitting his mistakes, but with Malik, he forced himself to try. I made a lot of bad choices, he admitted one evening. I wanted him to be like me, and I didn't listen when he wanted to be something else. Malik frowned. Like what? Elijah hesitated. I don't know. I never asked. The boy was quiet for a long moment, then nodded as if processing the answer. Elijah knew he would never be able to erase the damage done, but at least he could be honest about it now. And Malik, though cautious, was listening. One evening, as Elijah was leaving, Amara stepped onto the porch. He turned, expecting the usual quiet nod of acknowledgement before she disappeared back inside. But this time, she lingered. You're really trying, she said finally. Elijah met her gaze. I am, she exhaled. I didn't think you would. Why? Amara's expression was unreadable. Because I spent years thinking you didn't care. Elijah swallowed. I didn't know. Amara studied him for a moment, then nodded. I know. That was all she said before retreating inside. But it was enough. Elijah had spent his life chasing power, chasing wealth, chasing things that ultimately meant nothing. Now, for the first time, he was chasing something real. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Elijah Moore was not a man who let go easily. His entire life had been built on control, over his empire, over his reputation, over the vast fortune he had amassed. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, ensuring his legacy would outlast him. And yet, for the first time, he found himself questioning whether any of it mattered. It had started subtly. The long hours in his corporate office felt heavier, the boardroom discussions less urgent. The art he had spent millions collecting no longer inspired him the way it once had. And then there was Malik. Malik, who had pulled him out of the world he had built and forced him to see something else, something real. Elijah had spent years believing that his empire was his greatest achievement. But now, sitting across from his grandson during one of their weekly chess matches, he realized something terrifying. Malik didn't care about any of it. And maybe, just maybe, Elijah didn't either. It happened on a Friday afternoon during a meeting with his financial advisors. Elijah sat at the head of the conference table in his sleek, high-rise office, the city sprawling beneath him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His advisors were discussing investment strategies, the expansion of his art empire, the next big deal. And he wasn't listening. Instead, his mind was back in Westwood, in the backyard of a small house where a boy had handed him a flower pot and asked him to help. His mind was on the chessboard where Malik had finally beaten him last night, his triumphant grin widening as he moved his queen into checkmate. His mind was on something more important than stocks and assets. Elijah, one of the advisors, a middle-aged man with graying temples, was looking at him expectantly. The others around the table had fallen silent, waiting for his response. Elijah glanced down at the report in front of him. It was filled with numbers, projections, profits, things that had once defined his entire existence. And suddenly, he couldn't do it anymore. He closed the folder. I'm selling the gallery, he said. The silence was immediate. The advisors exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. "Elijah," one of them began cautiously. "The Moore Gallery is one of the most prestigious." "I know what it is," Elijah said, his voice firm. "I'm selling it." The shock in the room was almost palpable. "But why?" someone asked. Elijah looked out the window. For years, he had convinced himself that prestige was his legacy, that the gallery, the wealth, the power, these were the things that would ensure he was remembered. But that had never been true. His son had died, and his legacy had been nothing but silence. Now, he had a grandson. And Malik needed more than an empire he would never want. He needed family. He needed him. Without another word, Elijah stood. "Draw up the necessary paperwork. I want it done by the end of the month." The advisors hesitated, still stunned, but one by one they nodded. Elijah walked out of the meeting without looking back. For the first time in decades, he felt free. Selling the gallery made headlines. News outlets speculated endlessly about his reasons. Was it a financial strategy? A sign of retirement? Some secret scandal? Elijah ignored them all. He had spent too many years caring about public perception. Now he only cared about one thing. The night after the sale was finalized, he drove to Westwood. When he knocked on the door, Amara answered, her expression unreadable. "I heard about the gallery," she said. Elijah nodded. Amara studied him, searching for something. Finally, she exhaled. "Come in." Malik was in the living room, flipping through the pages of a book when Elijah stepped inside. The boy looked up, then frowned. "You look weird." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Malik tilted his head. "Less fancy." Elijah smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Malik closed his book. "Why are you here?" Elijah hesitated, then sat down across from him. "Because I wanted to tell you something." Malik waited. "I sold my gallery," Elijah said finally. Malik blinked. "Why?" Elijah exhaled. "Because it doesn't matter to me anymore." The boy considered this. "So, what does matter?" Elijah looked at him. "You," he said simply. "You and your mother." Malik didn't speak right away, but something in his expression softened. For the first time, Elijah saw it, the moment Malik let down his last wall of hesitation. "You want to play chess?" Malik asked after a long pause. Elijah smiled. "Only if you're ready to lose." Malik grinned. "We'll see about that." As he set up the board, Elijah realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business. He wasn't thinking about deals or investments. He was thinking about the future, the only future that mattered. And, for the first time, he knew he had made the right choice. Elijah Moore had spent a lifetime believing that success was measured in wealth, influence, and power. It had taken him decades to build his empire, to craft a legacy that would be remembered long after he was gone. And now, he was walking away from it all. Not because he had failed, not because he had lost, but because, for the first time, he had found something worth more than everything he had ever built. The sale of the gallery sent shockwaves through the business world. People speculated, debated, theorized. Some thought he was retiring. Others assumed he was making room for an even bigger acquisition. But Elijah didn't care. For the first time in decades, he was making a decision for himself. Not for shareholders, not for his reputation, but for his family. For Malik. For the grandson he never knew existed. For the boy who had grown up visiting a grave, searching for answers Elijah should have provided years ago. His next decision was easier than the first. He was selling the penthouse. It had once been a symbol of everything he had achieved. A sleek, towering testament to his dominance in the world of wealth, but now it felt empty. His entire life had been built around things: rare art, expensive furniture, the illusion of prestige. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. When the real estate agents arrived to discuss the sale, Elijah barely listened. He didn't care about the asking price, the potential buyers, or the market trends. He just wanted to be done with it. As they walked through the penthouse, discussing details, Elijah stood in his study, staring at the skyline through the massive windows. He had thought this view was the pinnacle of achievement. That standing above the city, looking down at everything he controlled, meant he had won. Now he realized he had spent his whole life looking at the wrong things. He didn't belong in a glass tower anymore. He belonged somewhere real, somewhere human. The day he handed over the keys to the penthouse, he packed lightly. There wasn't much he wanted to take with him. A few old photographs of Julian, ones he had buried in storage, too painful to look at before. A chess set. A small wooden carving that Malik had made for him, clumsily shaped into something that resembled a bird. Everything else? Unnecessary. For the first time in years, Elijah Moore was traveling light. Moving to Westwood was not something he had ever imagined himself doing, but then there were a lot of things he never imagined, like sitting in Amara Carter's kitchen, drinking coffee while she went over Malik's school schedule with him, like picking Malik up from school and having the boy roll his eyes when Elijah asked him how his day was, before immediately launching into a story about how he had beaten his friend at basketball, like fixing a broken step on Amara's porch and feeling more satisfaction in that one simple task than in closing billion-dollar deals, like feeling at home in a house that wasn't made of glass and steel, but of warmth and laughter. One evening, as the sun was setting, Elijah sat on the porch with Malik, watching as the boy absent-mindedly flipped a chess piece between his fingers. "You really gave up everything?" Malik asked suddenly. Elijah glanced at him. "It wasn't everything." Malik smirked. "The fancy cars? The big buildings? The private jets?" Elijah exhaled. "Those things weren't important." Malik was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. "So, what is important?" Elijah thought about that. For most of his life, he had been convinced that wealth was the answer, that status was the goal, that leaving behind an empire was the only way to be remembered. But now, he knew better. He looked at Malik, the boy who had once been a stranger, but was now the most important part of his life. "Family," Elijah said simply. Malik rolled his eyes. "That's corny." Elijah chuckled. "Maybe." Malik studied him for a moment, then nodded as if accepting the answer. "You know," the boy said, leaning back against the porch railing, "I think my dad would have liked this version of you better." Elijah's chest tightened, but in a way that didn't hurt. "Not anymore." "I think so too," he admitted. They sat in silence for a while, watching as the last light of the day faded from the sky. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Moore wasn't chasing anything, because for the first time, he already had everything he needed. Subscribe for more stories like this and explore our other videos. Don't forget to share this video with others who might enjoy it.